Welcome back to today's Explainer. We're taking a second look at the past today. We all have this pervasive image of the Dark Ages stuck in our heads, right? You picture a time of rampant ignorance, brutal barbarians, and just completely backward thinking. But here is the fascinating truth. Almost everything we think we know about this era is actually a modern fabrication. Okay, let's dive into this because we're going to systematically dismantle the Dark Ages myth right here using actual historical records to show you exactly how our modern perceptions got it completely wrong. So I want you to picture a fearsome Viking warrior charging into battle. What do you immediately see? Massive axes, braided beards, and, of course, those iconic, terrifying horned helmets, right? But we really have to ask ourselves here, did Vikings actually wear horned helmets into battle? Are those horns historical fact, or are they pure fiction? This expectation versus reality hook is exactly where our historical illusions start to crack. Let's tackle our first massive illusion. We've literally been taught for years that before Columbus, everyone thought you'd sail right off the edge of the planet. Well, it's completely made up. The reality is that scholars, sailors, and educated people during the Middle Ages fully understood the Earth was a sphere. The whole flat Earth, Dark Ages narrative is a total modern invention, basically created way after the fact to make later eras look, more enlightened by comparison. Speaking of myths, let's jump right back to those Vikings. Myth: Vikings wore horned helmets. Fact: Vikings wore totally normal, practical helmets. I know, it's honestly slightly disappointing. But it turns out that wearing giant handles on your head during close-quarters combat is, well, a pretty terrible tactical decision. Your enemy could literally just grab them. No, those iconic horns were never actually a thing in battle. They were just romanticized additions tacked on by much later opera designers, not actual historical warriors. Let's keep this momentum rolling and debunk one more classic pop culture fabrication that you've probably heard a million times. Myth: Napoleon was unusually short. Fact: Napoleon was actually of perfectly average height for his era. The infamous Napoleon complex, this idea that he was this tiny conqueror trying to overcompensate for his diminutive stature, is simply false. He was recorded at an absolutely average height for a Frenchman at the time. It was quite literally just enemy propaganda that shrunk him down in the history books. Crazy, right? Now, what's really interesting about this slide is that we are pivoting from historical fiction directly into biological fact. It's one thing to uncover that an opera designer stuck horns on a helmet or that a propagandist drew a caricature of a French emperor. It's entirely another to look at the hard physical data left behind. If we want to genuinely understand the reality of the people who lived during these heavily mythologized eras, we've got to look past the stories and examine the actual biology of human growth. 170 centimeters. That is the biological reality of the average Viking man's height. Just think about the massive contrast between our giant mythological expectations and this very grounded scientific metric. Pop culture paints Vikings as these towering behemoths who completely dwarfed everyone else in their path. But the skeletal remains and the biological data, they tell a much more human, grounded story. They were roughly 170 centimeters tall. And this brilliantly illustrates exactly what we're talking about. The biological data paints a super clear picture. The mighty, terrifying Vikings averaged 170 centimeters, and other Europeans of the exact same era, also 170 centimeters. They were roughly the exact same height. The biology of human growth during that period was constrained by the exact same diets, climates, and living conditions across the entire continent. They weren't giants. They were biologically indistinguishable in stature from the people they interacted with. So how in the world do we get from completely average height, hornless, round earth-knowing populations to the towering, primitive caricatures we believe in today? Let's zoom out to the bigger, philosophical picture here. It all comes down to what is defined as the gradual decline of data. This is basically the process where original historical truths are slowly obscured over time. I want you to really think about how you personally consume historical information. We almost never look at the raw data, right? We're usually looking at a copy of a story. It's like history unfolds in stages. Over at year 0, you have the original truth, a standard iron helmet, and average human height. But as decades pass, minor distortions start to creep in. Exaggerations are made for dramatic effect, maybe to make a story sound cooler, and then, by the time centuries have passed, the original data is completely buried by accumulated storytelling. It transforms into full-blown cultural fabrications. So the crucial point is, it all boils down to a gradual decline of data. Original truths fade away. The actual facts are replaced by whatever makes a better story, or whatever fits the narrative of a later era. And this is exactly why it's absolutely crucial that we actively question the structural integrity of the history we're taught. When you strip away all the embellishments and go back to the actual biological and historical records, the past wasn't nearly as bizarre as we've been led to believe. Which brings us to a really fascinating conclusion to wrap up this explainer. If entirely normal people were slowly transformed into flat earthers and horned giants through this gradual decline of data, what modern truths are going to become the historical myths of tomorrow? Really think about it. What perfectly normal things are we doing today that, 1,000 years from now, will be completely distorted by future cultural narratives? I hope this leaves you questioning your current reality just a little bit and eager to keep peeling back the layers of the past. Stay curious and keep questioning the data.